Saat ini saya sudah bersama dengan Duta Besar Inggris untuk Indonesia, His Excellency Owen Jenkins. Hello, Your Excellency. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. It's an honor for us to have you on our show today.
Not at all, it's my pleasure.
For starters, the Bank of England Outlook said that the UK economy will face the longest recession as the impact of the biggest interest rate hike in 33 years to curb soaring inflation that reached 10% level. So how is the current situation in the UK?
Well, the UK, like I think all countries in the world, is facing enormous economic headwinds. And you're absolutely right, it's the British government's top priority to manage that economic pressure and to protect the most vulnerable in our society. We're all facing inflationary pressures, particularly coming from Russia's unprovoked and illegal war in Ukraine, which has really driven up prices of fuel, of food around the world. And we're also coming to the end of an economic cycle, which is always tricky to manage. So our government, headed by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, is determined to tackle inflation, which always causes most harm to the most vulnerable in society, and to make sure that our economy and our public finances are on a stable footing. There are some difficult decisions ahead, but I think that's true for every country in the world, and we're determined to take them.
What a challenging situation. As we know, the UK has a new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. So what are the main focuses, policies in the first 100 days of the new leadership, especially to cope for people severe living cost?
Exactly, and I think you put your finger on it. His top priority is to ensure that British society doesn't have to face continually rising prices. He's determined to bring inflation back under control. The Bank of England has put up its interest rates, as you mentioned. They're of course independent, but the government is very supportive of their 2% inflation goal. And the Prime Minister and his Chancellor are also going to bring in a new budget on the 17th of November, which will set out how they're going to tackle the cost of living crisis, to protect the most vulnerable in our societies and make sure that our public finances are stable.
So is there a package for household to tackling the energy crisis as Germany did?
There is indeed. There's a very significant package of support to make sure that households are protected from these very high rises in prices driven by Putin's war, but also to protect businesses. So we've introduced an energy price guarantee, which will make sure that households' bills are capped. And we've introduced an energy prices bill, which on top of the energy price guarantee will make sure that businesses are protected from the worst of these rises.
So how's the Britain's continuing its policies that, as we know, the Ukraine and Russia were still ongoing?
So the war, tragically, is still ongoing. Russia seems determined to pursue this illegal and unprovoked war, despite the damage that it's doing, not just the horrific suffering that we're seeing imposed on Ukrainian civilians by Russia, but the wider damage around the world. And the UK is determined to continue to support Ukraine in its struggle, because Russia's war is not just against Ukraine. It also undermines international law. It's an attack on a sovereign country's territorial integrity and national sovereignty. And it's a clear breach of the UN Charter. And I was very proud, actually. I was delighted that the UK and Indonesia stood up together in the United Nations General Assembly to condemn that and to make clear that this is a violation of the UN Charter.
It's interesting to talk about the relationship between UK and Indonesia. So is there any special mission brought by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak for Southeast Asia region, particularly Indonesia?
So first thing to say is I think that the UK-Indonesia relationship is in a really good place at the moment. I think it's incredibly positive, and I feel very lucky to be the ambassador here at a time when there's such energy and growth in the UK-Indonesia relationship. I think that the Prime Minister is determined to continue the focus on Southeast Asia and on Indonesia in particular. And I know that he's particularly keen to expand our trade and investment in both directions to the benefit of our peoples and our economies, but also to continue the very positive collaboration we have on areas like climate change and energy, on education, and on culture.
Okay, speaking of climate change, last year the UK has hosted COP26. So what's the progress 1 year on, and what are you hoping for COP27, as we know it's still ongoing right now?
So we were very proud of our presidency of COP26. We think that it set the world on a path to meeting the Paris Agreement commitments and to keeping dangerous climate change within 1.5 degrees. And what we hope for from COP27 is implementation of those very ambitious commitments. The world needs to come together to address that dangerous climate change. The UK has always been a leader, both in setting those targets, in decarbonising our own economy, but also in supporting others, including developing countries, to achieve the same things. So that's what we're going to COP27 to achieve.
Okay, in COP27, Prime Minister unveiled £220 million package for the environment. So would you elaborate more about this?
So I'm not going to forestall anything the Prime Minister might announce at COP27. I will let him speak for himself. But I know that he goes there to reinforce the UK's position as one of the leading donors to climate finance. And I know that he goes there with a particular desire to focus on things which matter to the poorer nations of the world, to focus on adaptation, to focus on the loss and damage which is caused by climate change to countries around the world, but particularly the poorest, and to make sure that finance for addressing those issues is really brought to the forefront of the conversation, and that we're not just focusing on emissions reductions, important though they are.
Okay, let's move on to the energy crisis that, as we know, is very highlighted global situation right now as winter season is coming. So what is the UK's government's policies to dealing with the threat of winter energy crisis at the end of this year?
So it's a difficult situation, and obviously the best thing to solve the crisis would be for Russia to end its illegal war in Ukraine, and then a lot of these things could be addressed more rationally. Russia doesn't seem inclined to do that. It seems determined to continue with its brutal campaign. So the UK government, in terms of our own energy policy, is focused on two things. The first is on protecting our societies, and particularly the most vulnerable in British society, from the impacts of that rise in energy. And I've talked a little bit about what we've done with our energy price guarantee and our energy prices bill. The second thing that the government is doing is to make sure that British supply of energy is robust. The UK is not as vulnerable to Russian gas supplies, it's not as dependent as some of our European partners. We have our own supplies. We've secured more than 1 billion additional cubic meters of gas from Norway. We have the biggest liquefied natural gas facilities in Europe, and we have enormous renewable resources, including the biggest offshore wind farm in Europe, which can supply more than 1.2 million homes just from that one farm. So we're trying to do everything we can to reinforce that by importing more gas, by protecting and supporting our domestic supplies, but as I say, also making sure that the vulnerable in society are protected from the rises which will come in the UK as around the world.
Okay, so those are the strategies to prevent the energy crisis as winter is coming. And if we look at the situation right now, has business currently activity started to be disrupted by gas supplies caused by British sanctions against Russia?
So business is also obviously affected by the price rises which have come from Russia's war. The sanctions against Russia are very targeted on preventing Putin from being able to fund his war machine. And we're not seeing negative or major negative effects on businesses in the UK. But businesses, of course, will suffer from the price rises which Putin has caused through his illegal war. And as I said, part of our energy prices bill is designed to protect businesses from the volatility and the very extreme price rises which we've seen. So we'll continue with that work. I think sanctions are an essential part of our toolkit for pushing Russia to end the war. But we will make sure that our businesses can continue to operate.
Okay, let's move on to the G20 topic. So what's the plan for the presence of the new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak for the upcoming G20 that will be held in Indonesia? So what are the issues that want to be highlighted?
So our new Prime Minister is very much looking forward to visiting Bali for the G20 summit. It was one of the things which he committed to very early on in his premiership. He knew that it was a really important occasion. And in terms of what he's bringing, what I would say is the first thing that he's bringing is strong support for the Indonesian presidency. Indonesia set out the perfect agenda to recover together, recover stronger, to focus on international health, on digital transformation and on energy transition. As we came out of the pandemic at the beginning of 2022, that was the perfect agenda, and I want to pay tribute to Indonesia for defining it so well. Of course, that agenda and Indonesia's presidency was severely disrupted by Russia's decision, as I say, against international law to invade Ukraine. But I think Indonesia has done the right thing in continuing to focus on the economic agenda, because it's tough for all of our countries. So I know that our Prime Minister will bring strong support for that agenda, which Indonesia continues rightly to push and to support. The second thing he will come wanting to talk about, of course, is Russia's war against Ukraine. That is something which is having a huge impact on the politics and on the economy of the world. And we're keen to make sure that the 20 big economies in the world discuss that and recognise the damage that President Putin has done to all of us. But he'll want to do that in a constructive way, not one which cuts across that very important economic conversation.
Okay, well, thank you for your time for us, Your Excellency. Stay healthy.
You too. Thank you very much.
Demikian interview kami bersama dengan Duta Besar Inggris untuk Indonesia, His Excellency Owen Jenkins. Saya Andi Shalini, CNBC Indonesia, Beyond Business. Thank you for your time.
No, my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for coming in.